Will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled "The End of Affordable Housing?" ? A review of the Trump administration's plans to change housing finance in America. Before I recognize my staff members, today is Mr. McHenry's birthday. If anyone wishes to sing happy birthday, please save it until later. Thank you.
We all thank you for that, Madam Chair.
Happy birthday. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. Good morning. Today we're here to discuss the impact of the Trump administration's housing finance reform plans. We are joined by Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, HUD Secretary Ben Carson, and Federal Housing Finance Agency Director Mark Calabria. Welcome. Let me say up front that the Trump administration's housing finance reform plan would be a disastrous for our housing systems. The Trump administration is threatening to end the conservatorship of the government-sponsored enterprise, that is the GSEs, without congressional action to provide an explicit government guarantee. If implemented in this way, it is likely it would create turmoil in the housing market, prevent many Americans from obtaining 30-year fixed-rate mortgages, and block families across the country from attaining the American dream of home ownership. With this reckless plan for administrative action on the table, the Trump administration also recommends that Congress make several harmful legislative reforms. For example, the Trump plan would abolish the affordable housing goals, which help to support affordable home ownership and rental housing, and replace them with a mortgage fee that Trump officials have not bothered to spell out the details for. The plan would also fundamentally undermine the Federal Housing Administration's ability to create affordable home ownership opportunities. The Trump administration has proven again and again that it is not to be trusted. It has consistently pushed for harmful housing policies and for slashing and eliminating key housing funding for those most in need. This is an administration that has proposed tripling rents on our lowest income households and slashing HUD's budget by 18%. This is an administration that has eliminated protections for LGBTQ individuals, blocked Dreamers from FHA loans, and proposed to make it nearly impossible for victims of housing discrimination to obtain justice. This is an administration that reportedly wants to raise homeless camps and round up persons experiencing homelessness and force them to live in decrepit federal buildings. By contrast, Democrats on this committee have put forth measures to improve the affordability and availability of housing. For example, we have bills to end the homelessness crisis, make FHA mortgages more affordable, and protect Dreamers, LGBTQ individuals, families, and children with mixed immigration statuses, and foster youth. When it comes to the housing finance system, I've long maintained that any housing finance reform proposal should adhere to certain key principles. These principles include maintaining access to the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, ensuring sufficient private capital is in place to protect taxpayers, providing stability and liquidity so that we withstand any future financial crisis, ensuring a smooth transition to a new finance system, requiring transparency and standardization in a way that ensures a level playing field for all financial institutions, especially credit unions and community banks, maintaining access for all qualified borrowers that can sustain home ownership and serving homeowners of the future, and ensuring access to affordable rental housing. It is clear that the Trump administration proposal does not live up to these principles. Today, this committee will examine why the officials who are our witnesses today are supporting such a harmful plan. I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, for 4 minutes for an opening statement. I want to welcome today's distinguished
Well, thank
panel.
you, Madam Chair, and I want
We
to
will
thank
first
the
hear
distinguished
from the
panel for
Honorable
being here.
Stephen T. Mnuchin, Secretary, U.S. Department of the Treasury. Secretary Mnuchin has testified previously before the committee and needs no introduction. Welcome. We will then hear from the Honorable Dr. Benjamin S. Carson, Secretary, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Secretary Carson has also testified previously before the committee and needs no introduction. Welcome. Finally, we will hear from the Honorable Dr. Mark A. Calabria, Director, Federal Housing Finance Agency. This is Director Calabria's first appearance before the committee. He has served as Director of the FHFA since April of this year. In recent years, he has served on the Republican staff of the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Development, worked at Cato Institute, and most recently as Chief Economist to Vice President Michael Pence. Welcome, Director Calabria. For purposes of testimony, each of you will have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. Secretary Mnuchin, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony. Calabria. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Director Calabria, you recently announced that you're expecting to make a decision very soon about FHFA's proposed capital rule. This rule would be a key factor in determining whether pricing of GSE loans will work for a broad base of future homeowners or unnecessarily block credit-worthy people out of the American dream of home ownership. As you know, civil rights advocates and others have raised concerns that this rule would increase incentives for Fannie and Freddie to engage in more risk-based pricing, which would eliminate cross-subsidies that help minorities and other underserved borrowers obtain mortgages at affordable rates. There are also concerns that you will require up to 5% capital, which many analysts believe to be too high. Will FHA's final rule on capital levels address these concerns? Thank you very much. At what level of capital would you feel that the GSEs are safely capitalized?
Since we are in the midst of a rulemaking, I think it's appropriate for me to refrain from giving specific answers on the rulemaking. Again, we'll keep...
Do you believe that a higher level of capital would affect the pricing of a mortgage? I understand that you have I want you to understand that you have an obligation to the taxpayers, but you also have an obligation to ensure broad access to credit for credit-worthy borrowers. Your job requires you to strike an appropriate balance between these goals. However, based on what I can see from your actions and comments to date, I am concerned that you're overly focused on shrinking the GSE's footprint, even if it comes at the expense of blocking hardworking families out of home ownership. So I would encourage you to thoughtfully consider the feedback that you are receiving from civil rights advocates and others about this proposed capital rule and ensure that these concerns are addressed in a final rule. Further, Director Calabria, we met at the very beginning of your tenure as director of FHFA, and in that conversation, I stressed the importance of working to increase home ownership opportunities for minorities. Sometimes people conflate minority home ownership with affordable home ownership, and I want to be clear that these are two different things. We have made important strides in opening up affordable home ownership opportunities, but we still have African American home ownership levels at rates lower than when the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. And we have an astonishing racial wealth gap that reflects this gap in home ownership rates. Do you agree that FHFA has a responsibility to address the racial home ownership gap and not just access to affordable home ownership generally? So are you telling me that you have specific actions that you have taken and actions that you plan to take to increase access to home ownership for minority borrowers?
Foreclosures are devastating.
Can you use the word minority?
I can use the word minority, but I think we want to look out for all families, minority families.
Well, I know you are, but I specifically asked you about the wealth gap and the problems that we have with home ownership for minorities. Will you address the word minority?
If
it's difficult for you, then I will yield my time back. And with that, I will call on the gentleman from North Carolina for 5 minutes for questions. The gentleman has noticed his concerns. They have been responded to. And
Madam Chair,
the
they've not
gentle
been
lady was
responded to.
referring to the agency. And if your concern is about language unbecoming a member, then you should address that to all of the members. At any given time, we have all had language that one could consider unbecoming.
Madam
With that,
Chair, Madam
we
Chair,
will move on.
to accuse a cabinet secretary of personal corruption, which is what the gentlelady did, is not becoming of members of this committee.
The gentleman is out of order. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas,
Ridiculous.
is recognized for 5
Madam
minutes.
Chairwoman, I need a 5-minute biological break.
You are excused for 5 minutes. We will recess for 5 minutes. Committee will come to order. The gentlewoman from Ohio, Mrs. Beatty, is also the chair for the subcommittee on diversity and inclusion. Thank you. I'd like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. This hearing is adjourned. Thank you very much.
And then